Hello, my name is Andrew Keane. Welcome to Keane on America, the daily show about everything that matters, with the world's leading commentators and thinkers. Hello, everybody. As we continue to digest 2025, the decision seems to be in. AI is the person of the year. Time ran a cover featuring 7 or perhaps 8 of Silicon Valley's great AI titans sitting on a construction site or balancing on a construction site above what looks like to be a bombed out city. Lots of familiar faces on there, including Elon Musk and Sam Altman. But one person who wasn't up there was my guest today, the great Gary Marcus, who's perhaps emerged in 2025 as AI's leading, if not critic, certainly skeptic when it comes to generative AI. Gary is joining us from Montreal. Gary, were you disappointed not to be a AI person of the year for Time for 2025?
I don't. I'll decline to answer that. I was not expecting to be on the cover. I do think that one of the interesting things about this year is that there's actually a lot of movement towards the architectures that I've pushed for a long time. I don't think that's widely recognized yet, but things that I have pushed are not using pure LLMs, having more modular systems, using neurosymbolic approaches, and thinking about world models. When all the dust is settled and people go back and read what I wrote over the recent decades, they'll see we are moving in that direction. I don't expect Time Magazine to get it, but I think history will be kinder to me than Time Magazine was. Let's put it that way.
Well, Time Magazine usually catches up. Maybe in a few years, there'll be a cover for AI skeptics. I want to ask you about...
It's not about my skepticism. It's about the positive agenda that I've been pushing for a long time. Go back and reread the article that I wrote in 2020 called The Next Decade in AI. And I think you'll see that we spent the last 5 years not doing that. But towards the tail end of the year, people started doing the things that I recommended. They started putting in symbolic systems. They started focusing on world models, which is what that article was about.
So let's talk about, Gary, 2025. You wrote an interesting Substack piece, 6 or 7 predictions for AI 2026 from what you describe yourself as a generative AI realist. So let's drop the skeptic and just describe you as an AI realist. You have to acknowledge, though, that 2025 has been a pretty, in spite of all perhaps the limitations of generative AI, it's been an amazing year for AI, hasn't it?
Maybe. Towards the end of the year, I think what we've actually seen is a retreat and a relabeling. So we have seen a retreat from claims about artificial general intelligence. Many people thought it would happen this year. Many people thought that GPT-5 would be artificial general intelligence. GPT-5 was not artificial general intelligence. The people who had the thing in April, the report called AI 2027 backed down from their timelines and said it's not actually going to happen that we get AGI in 2027. The stock market went up and up and up. And then in November, it said, you know what? We're not sure we believe this stuff. Oracle in September, almost doubled overnight, and now it's lost all of the gain. That near doubling was over, this big AI deal that they had sort of made. I think this is a year in which there's actually been a lot of disillusionment. There was also that MIT study, which has since been replicated by a number of other places, showing that most companies who use this stuff are not getting return on investment. So, certainly there were some advances this year, as there have been in previous years. I don't think that there was a great leap forward the way that there had been in many of the previous years. I think that there were small gains across the board. I think more people recognize that getting good score on a benchmark doesn't mean that it's going to work for you in actual application in the company. You had Zuckerberg go full steam ahead and then kind of back off. So there was a lot of energy earlier in the year, and I think a lot of it backed down. I don't think, Time represented that in their cover
Yeah, I
at
mean,
all.
I don't know
But
how Zuckerberg got on the scaffolding, but he managed to creep on at the
money,
end.
money. And I mean, he doesn't actually have that much to show for it. Facebook in the early days of Jan LeCun being there was clearly number two to DeepMind, and it's an also ran right now. There's Zuckerberg spent all this money, a lot of salaries, but at least so far he doesn't have anything in particular to show for it. Llama 4 was another one of the disappointments of this year. People also thought it would be amazing, and then yeah, it was kind of on a par with a bunch of other models, and it was disappointing. A lot of the reviews were bad. Certainly, I don't think Meta had a particularly good year in AI. It had an expensive year in AI. They spent whatever it was, $30
To
billion.
put it mildly, yeah. I think we
But
need a
but
better word than expensive.
I don't
Uh,
want to knock everybody off the girder there. That seems kind of
yeah,
dangerous. But
well, the two guys who seem very comfortable on there, I don't want to talk about Musk, he's boring, but the Jensen Huang of Nvidia is right in the middle of it. He seems very comfortable up there. He had a good year, didn't he?
Jensen had a great year. So Nvidia is a very well-run company, has been for a long time. Their product is great. They only have one problem, which is the insane acceleration that they have depends on people continuing to buy their chips indefinitely in large quantities. And all of these studies showing a lack of productivity, and all of these reports showing, for example, that OpenAI is losing $3 billion a month or something on that order of magnitude, are not so good for him. So as long as there's demand, he will do very well. But I think if you look at what happened to his stock price, it hit a wall in around middle of July. I think it hit 180, and it has wiggled since then, but it is in fact the same place it was in July 6 months later. And that's because people have started to raise some questions about demand, about whether these chips really make back the money that people are spending on them, whether there really is the long-term demand. A lot of the initial demand was people got really excited because they thought that artificial general intelligence was imminent. There's a guy from Sequoia, I'm blanking on his name, who recently said the only thing that justifies the sort of trillions of dollars that we have cumulatively valued these companies at is if AGI is forthcoming. But the Sequoia guy didn't say this, but I'll tell you this: AGI is not coming soon, and I think a lot of people actually figured that out this year, and that makes a lot of those investments questionable, and that is a problem for Nvidia, despite it being a very well run company. It raises the question of whether the demand for the chips will remain. We might wind up in a situation where there's oversupply. Sometimes you build too many shopping malls, or too many, this or that or whatever, too many apartment buildings, there's oversupply. This happened in China recently. They built too many apartment buildings, it was oversupply. Suddenly they weren't worth that much. We might have too many chips in a couple of years from now.
Yeah,
Another
that's an
thing I didn't
interesting way
mention,
of
by the
putting it. It
oh,
certainly makes sense given America's history with shopping malls. Um, when it comes to new chips, Gary, what about Google and their new chip and their year? Their stock price has certainly done well in the last 6 months of the year.
I think Google had the best year among the places. Well, sorry, that's probably too flip. But Google had a really good year in the following sense. I won't say best. Um, Nvidia had a great year too. Uh, Google had a really good year in the sense of, at the beginning of the year, most people, not me, thought that OpenAI had a huge advantage over Google, and that Google was not going to catch up. I've been writing pieces, as you well know, in my Substack for a while, saying that OpenAI might not sustain its advantage, that it faced a lot of headwinds and so forth. Well, by the end of the year, Google came out with Gemini, which is on a par with GPT 5 point whatever, 5.2, or even maybe a little better, depending on who you talk about. So Google caught up, and that's bad for OpenAI, and it's great for Google. And Demis Hassabis, I think, is the most impressive of the people, putting Jensen to a side, the most impressive of the people on that beam, in terms of his technical talent to manage a broad array of interesting people who might do different things in AI, because we need different things in AI. He's one of maybe two real scientists on the girder there. The others are
Well, next to
managers or
Amadai, who's also a real scientist, I assume.
I'm losing faith in Amadai. He's saying some pretty absurd things about bioscience that suggest to me that he's not such a great scientist. I know he's got a degree and whatsoever, but what's and so on. But he has said, for example, I won't be able to give you the exact quote, but basically led people to believe that we might cure cancer in the next few years, and that's not going to happen. The reality is you need to do the clinical studies. And he's been very fast and loose with his extrapolations. Don't make a lot of sense to me. I don't have the same trust in Amadei as I once did.
Coming back, Gary, to OpenAI, you and I have had lots of funny conversations about Sam Altman. He's up on the girder at the moment. People are talking about 2026 as the Netscape moment because OpenAI and Anthropic are supposed to do their IPOs. But is OpenAI now the Netscape of this age in the sense that it's simply going to be increasingly a footnote to what happens in the future?
Well, what I said a couple of years ago, and I stand by, is that they might be the WeWork of the AI era, which is not an entirely different metaphor. The reason I thought of WeWork is it was briefly valued at a lot, and then eventually its valuation plummeted. I think OpenAI is in real trouble. And there's real trouble for a number of reasons. One is that a lot of talent has left. Two is that Google has caught up. Three is that they don't have the same resources as Google, and what they're doing is very expensive. One of the most interesting interviews of the year was when Brad Gerstner asked Sam Altman, "Hey, you've got, whatever it is, $10 billion in revenue, and you've made $1.4 trillion. How do you square that circle?" And Gerstner is an investor in the company and was kind of laid it out in a softball way. He could have made it worse and said, and also you're losing $3 billion a month. This makes no sense. But he didn't say that. He gave a soft version of it. And Altman kind of flipped out on him and said, well, if you want to sell your stock, you can. And didn't actually give an answer. And that was the turning point, I think, in many people's minds. Like, can Sam actually pull this off? He doesn't seem to actually have a plan to make the economics work. So my guess is either they get absorbed by Microsoft or they have a rough road to hoe here. Google may overtake them. Sam sees this too, right? He wrote a memo towards the end of the year saying we're facing strong headwinds. He declared a code red. Like, I would not say that he's in the best of shape right now.
Yeah, code red. I don't quite know what that means. Does it really matter, though? We all enjoy bashing Sam. He's slightly annoying. He's not as annoying as Musk, but he's annoying. Does it really matter in the long term, Gary?
Paris Marx, by the way, just had a event of 64, like a Final Four kind of scorecard thing for who was the worst person in tech, and
who won?
Were there in the quarterfinals. When I saw it, it wasn't yet finished, but you could check his LinkedIn page. So sorry, what was your question? Does it matter?
From a long-term AI tech point of view, does it really matter?
If OpenAI goes out of business, is that what you're asking?
If it is indeed, I've talked about it as the Netscape. You suggest it's the WeWork, which suggests a degree of, if not dishonesty, certainly dodginess.
Yes and no. So yeah, and Sam's dodginess has become clearer and clearer. There was a video on YouTube now about Sam Altman con man that was doing very well. We could or could not go into that, but so here's your question as I understand it. If OpenAI takes a big hit, they don't have to go out of business, but WeWork didn't go out of business, but they took a big hit. What happens? Well, two things happen. One is Google takes their place. So LLMs are a commodity. There might be other kinds of AI, but OpenAI has never shown any particular talent in the other forms of AI the way that I think DeepMind has. And so if LLMs fade and they're a commodity, everybody can do them. They do them cheaply. There's not much profit to be made. OpenAI goes under. Other people will take their place. Google will just fill in the gap. Maybe Microsoft will, etc. So the world doesn't need to bail out OpenAI. If they go out of business, then so be it. Other people will take their place. But there is a psychological cost, right? Which is OpenAI has been, let's say, the poster child for generative AI. And they have kind of lifted all boats to some degree. And if they do take a hit, other boats are going to decline. So, for example, if OpenAI couldn't make the round that they're talking about making now, a $750 billion round. If they didn't get that, raise that funding, people would start to get nervous, and that would probably hit Nvidia's stock price, for example. And you might start to see dominoes kind of fall around that, CoreWeave, et cetera. And it could affect the broader market. There's a question of how much all of these companies are leveraged, whether banks would have problems with liquidity and so forth. So on a technical side, everything that OpenAI is doing could easily be replaced by other competitors. On a psychological side, like, would there be like a bank run kind of phenomena? Maybe.
You're a realist when it comes to LLMs. You've been an open critic, and I think you've been proved right in some ways. There was an Axios headline which suggested that you said, and correct me if you didn't say this, that LLMs are a dress rehearsal for AGI. Does that mean, Gary, that you believe in this idea of AGI? I've always thought of it as a bit of a straw man, as something that people just invent to make one point or another. Is this really such a thing as AGI?
Well, not yet, for sure. We'll start with that. It's a complicated set of questions. So does AGI exist now? No. The only, quote, general intelligence we really know is human intelligence, which is not perfect, but is fairly general. That is an existence proof that you could build some form, possibly flawed, general intelligence like us. I don't see any principled reason why machines should not be able to do that eventually. I see a lot of principled reasons why LLMs can't do that, but that's a different question. I don't see anything that stops us from discovery. Now, at the same time, it is true that many people have used it in vague ways. I think there are actually somewhat precise ways of talking about it, but lots of people have used it as vague ways to pump their stocks and so forth. So, many people use the term for different things. They use it in different ways. There was a reasonably nice paper by Dan Hendricks, Joshua Bengio, and I was an author on it recently, trying to give a definition of AGI that fits reasonably well with things that I've given before and that the people who coined the term gave before, which is Shane Legg, Peter Voss, and Ben Goertzel. So there is a core definition, which is making machines as resourceful and flexible as humans. And I don't see any principled reason why we won't get there. I don't think we're there now. But if you're talking 100 years from now, sure, I'm pretty confident we'll get there in 100 years. If you're talking 1,000 years, unless we blow ourselves up, which is possible, I think we will get there. Will we get there in 10 years? A small chance.
Well, we're not going to get there in 2026, are we? That's you come out with 6 or 7 predictions, and your first is we won't get to AGI in 2026, but we'll be closer. How much closer?
I don't know that we'll necessarily be closer. I think we will. I don't think between 2020 and 2025 that we did actually get that much closer. Like, LLMs got a little better, mostly because we used more data and more chips, and they perform better. That doesn't mean that they're actually on the right track to artificial general intelligence. My guess is we will use LLMs as a component in artificial general intelligence, but the progress that we made in the last 5 years may not really be the kind of main path to getting there. It won't hurt. But if you think about Kahneman's System 1 and System 2, in System 1 is fast and automatic, statistical in nature. System 2 is deliberative. It's more like reasoning. Lots of creatures have System 1. LLMs are kind of like System 1. They're a really good version of System 1. But you need System 2 also. That's where I think a lot of the action is, a lot of the action to come. And the work that we've done hasn't necessarily moved us towards that. So, you can make progress, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's progress towards what you want. In alchemy, they figured out little bits about chemistry here and there, but it wasn't until somebody figured out the periodic table that there was really a firm theory to base it all on. My guess is that 2026 will be a better year in terms of actual innovation, because I think that people are finally waking up. I left this out of my beginning summary. If you look around the field, there's a lot of people who used to be kind of hostile to the way I talk about things who've actually moved over to my side of things. That's another way in which I think it's sort of long-term good for AI, but it's not good for LLM. So Rich Sutton, for example, is famous for what he calls the bitter lesson, which has basically meant that all the progress we've made has been by using more data and not rich knowledge. But he conceded this year that LLMs were not going to be there, and he actually conceded to me and said, "Gary, you were right." I mean, he's a Turing Award winner, a big deal in the field. And then Ilyas Letskever was not so kind to me, but he gave an interview with Dwarkesh that was basically saying all the things I've been saying all along, that LLMs are not enough, that we need to go back to doing fundamental research and so forth. And so, there was a lot of shift towards the positions that I have long held this year, which I think is good long term for AI, but bad for those who thought that LLMs were the answer.
Certainly good for Gary Marcus. Gary, you're skeptical, and again, correct my language if it's wrong, on robots in 2026. You argue that human domestic robots like Optimus and Figure will be all demo and very little product. In other words, we're not going to get any robots in 2026. Is that fair? Or at least one
Not in your home that does anything interesting. I mean, like there's this Neo robot that people like Joanna Stern and Marcus Brownlee already reviewed, and it was mostly teleoperated. It was slow. It couldn't really do much. I think that the chance of that prediction of mine saying that you're not really going to get this in the home is basically 100%. There'll be some demos and whatever, but solving the reliability problems and also the manipulation problems, the navigation problem, the cognitive problems, is just way beyond what we can do this year. Like there's no chance. You have a whole bunch of companies like Figure making a lot of noise right now and big valuations, but they're not going to have, products by this time next year that like people are wild about and they sell 100,000. It's just not happening. You might have better toy robots next year that are, a foot tall and have ChatGPT installed in them and you can talk to them and play with. I mean, people are working on that kind of stuff and that's realistic, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, Rosie the robot that can do whatever you ask and so forth. That's not happening this year or in 2026.
No Rosie the robot in 2026. You no great fan of Donald Trump. You had an interesting Substack, a sad day for America, on Trump's decision to nix state by state policy on AI. You also note that there aren't going to be any winners internationally. No country will take a decisive lead in the race. I mean, there are only two people in this race, aren't there, Gary? China and the US?
Yeah, I mean, you put in a sentence that wasn't quite mine. So let me put it in my own words. China and the US are going to remain in front of other people in LLMs, just to be clear. In that sense, they're both winners. But what we will not have is one of those wildly overtaking the other. It's going to be more like Coke and Pepsi, right? Coke and Pepsi, neither is going to annihilate the other. We're always going to have Coke, we're always going to have Pepsi. Chinese customers are going to use Chinese LLMs. US customers are mostly going to use US LLMs, especially for high security applications. For low security ones, they may use Chinese LLMs, which may be cheaper. But there's not going to be like a wipeout where Google just stops making LLMs and we get everything from Tencent or something. I mean, this is not going to happen, and vice versa is not going to happen either. China's not going to say, to hell with it, we're all going to use Google. Like those are not actual scenarios. Like a lot of people in Silicon Valley like to sell this notion, oh, China's going to win, we have to do X or Y. This is not actually going to happen that way.
I think your fourth prediction, Gary, is the most interesting, particularly given your work. This suggestion that work on new approaches like world models and neurosymbolic will escalate in contrast to LLMs. Explain how that will manifest itself.
I mean, in 2026, it's mostly going to be research and announcements of companies. So you already have Fei Li and Jan LeCun are saying they're working on world models.
And they're on the board. Feifei's on that in that image, isn't she?
I think that's 2/3 of her on the right, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
So more people will talk about doing world models. I don't think a good solution is at hand. I think it's a very difficult problem, and I think it's one of these problems where once you have the basic idea, you still have a lot of work to do. So, like, I'm not sure we will see in 2026 a world model that, a world model based AI, and we could talk about what that actually means, suddenly displaces all LLMs. It's not gonna happen that fast. But we are gonna see more people trying to do that. And already we've seen Fei Li and Jan LeCun and etc. and we could go in a little deeper about what all that means. The same thing with neurosymbolic AI. Already, in fact, companies, although they don't like to admit it, partly because they don't like me, are in fact using neurosymbolic AI. So they are taking inside their neural networks things like code interpreter, their classic symbolic AI. What is neurosymbolic AI? It's finding an integration between neural networks like LLMs and symbolic systems. And that's what they're doing now. A couple years ago, it was all LLMs all the time, and they didn't have any symbolic systems. And I kept saying, you need to have symbolic systems. I gave a lot of arguments for that, going back to the year 2001, earlier even. Well, they haven't said it publicly, but that's what they're doing now. So
And you
that is
noted that
already
of all the figures on the beam, Demis Hassabis is the smartest. What are Google going to be doing in terms of these new systems in 2026?
They are already working on both very actively. So they have a very large effort on world models. One approach that they've taken is these systems that try to create video games from looking at a few frames and stuff like that. It's a very interesting line of work. It's not, as far as I know, integrated into Gemini yet, but I'm sure that they are working on that. And they've been doing neurosymbolic models for years. There's some elements of that in AlphaFold. These other systems like Alpha Proof, Alpha Geometry, Alpha Evolve are very explicitly neurosymbolic systems. So they've very actively been pursuing this. At the panel where I talked about a dress rehearsal, Demis was the next speaker after me, and we spoke afterwards, and he spoke on stage. And he's very clearly pursuing both of these approaches. And part of why I think he will win long term is he understands how to make these long term investments.
Your sixth prediction is actually kind of retrospective. You seem to be suggesting that 2026 will be the post-bubble year. Is that fair?
Ish. So I think it could go two different ways, but they're related. So one is people might, by the end of 2026, say, that was the bubble, and everything might collapse sort of during 26, and they might move on to other things, or maybe that's what happens in 2026 is that it's not really post-bubble, it's bubble collapsing year. So it's either bubble collapsing, I sort of have to mix my metaphors. Either it's just the bubble collapsing, or we get back up on our feet and try some new stuff, and probably a bit of both.
And you mentioned Oracle. Are they the clown in this story?
Before we get to that, you didn't quite capture what that last prediction was about. It was really about, well, there was a seventh prediction too, but the numbered predictions, it wasn't really about the bubble, it was about Backlash. That last prediction
Yeah, I
was
want
the
to get to Backlash, the politics, but I just wanted to talk about the fifth prediction
Oracle,
first.
I wrote a piece in September 11th, called Peak Bubble. And I said, on the day in which Oracle jumped up, I said, this doesn't make any sense. And people are going to look back at that and say, this was the peak of the bubble. I didn't mean, and I tried to be careful about it, that was the highest that any stock would go, although it turned out that for Oracle it was. What I meant is that people would, in hindsight, when they tell the story of what happened in the mid 2020s, they're going to look at that and they're going to say, that was the most crazy, insane thing, that stock went up to $300 from 200 or whatever it was overnight because Oracle made a hypothetical deal, or not hypothetical, but a not entirely binding deal with OpenAI, drove prices up insanely. And in fact, what happened is Oracle dropped to about 200 or 190. It's actually lower now than it was when I wrote that piece. It went straight down. That was the best stock tip I ever gave, probably. A friend of mine made a bunch of money off of it. They collapsed from them. And there is a picture, I'm trying to remember who it was. Bloomberg commissioned a picture of Larry Ellison in a bath with bubbles around him. I mean, he is already being treated by some as a clown because of these circumstances.
Yeah,
I don't want
and
to call
he's
him a
not
clown.
on the girder of time. He must have fallen off the girder. He's already on he's lots of pieces on the floor, isn't he?
I mean, I think he made a deal that made sense for him. And the problem is that the stock market took it too seriously as a sign that something magical had happened to this company. I mean, I think it was rational for him to make deals. So I don't want to call him a clown here. But I think that the street for a couple days got goofy about it. It's not necessarily his fault. He did what he needed to do. But it wasn't convincing, and eventually people figured out that it
I
was
don't think many
ridiculous.
people will be shedding a lot of tears about Larry Ellison. A few days ago, Bernie Sanders announced that he wanted an AI data center moratorium. You already predicted this for 2026. Backlash to generative AI and radical deregulation will escalate. What do you think of Bernie Sanders' call for a what he calls a moratorium, whatever that means, on AI data centers?
I mean, I'm not sure I would be with him on that. I think it's a complicated question.
Well, it's not that complicated.
Well, I think the argument that he's giving, this is the first, I somehow missed this piece of news. It seems that the argument that he's giving there is because he's worried that AI is going to accelerate too fast. I'm less worried about the kind of like AI is going to kill us all kind of thing. I do think, well, there's two things. One is I think we should talk about backlash more broadly than just the Bernie Sanders thing. I'm not worried that all these data centers are going to lead to AI killing us in the short term anyway. But I am worried that we're not spending enough research time on AI alignment. And I'm worried that we are spending too much money on LLMs, which cannot be aligned. And so, like, I can see a little bit of reason to go there. I would not be inclined to put such a moratorium myself. I can see some argument for it, but I think it's part of a larger phenomenon, which is a lot of people are pushing back, A, on the lack of regulation, and B, on AI in general. Like, kids now say that's AI when somebody makes a mistake. And, a lot of grown-ups are really upset at Trump over this thing about a moratorium on states. I mean, and not just the left, but people like Steve Bannon and Marsha Blackburn, and Ron DeSantis are pushing back. I do think that AI policy is really going to be on the agenda in the 2026 election. That was what the prediction was about, in a way that we didn't see in 2024. In the 2024 debates, Kamala Harris mentioned AI once. I don't think Trump mentioned it at all. It's going to be a big deal in the next election.
And what would you like? I mean, Newsom's already running, it seems, for president. What should be the position of progressives, Democrats, on AI? You noted in your sixth prediction that
progressives and Democrats and Republicans both should think, number one, the federal government should protect the citizens. And that falls out in a bunch of different ways. One is, I think that the government has to have some oversight in the way that we do over drugs. So if you're going to roll something out to 100 million people, you need to show that it is safe. That's not even on the agenda right now, but it should be. And everybody, both parties should think that, because we've already seen lots of negative consequences of AI, ranging from non-consensual deep fake porn to misinformation to cybercrime and so forth. We've already seen this, and we've already seen the companies try to shield themselves from liability, and we've seen the federal government's not doing anything. The way that fits in with the states' right thing is the states can see that. Even DeSantis, who's a far right Republican, can see that, and he put his own Bill of Rights for his state, Bill of AI rights for his state, which is something that the Biden administration did too. When both sides are telling you that, it's not a liberal or progressive issue. It's a humans versus Silicon Valley issue.
Finally, Gary, let's talk about Gary Marcus himself. What kind of year has 2025 been for you? Anytime I ever hear a discussion about AI, your name somehow comes up. I don't quite know how or why, but you're in the debate. You're in the conversation. You're not on the beam. You're probably lucky not to be on the beam. Have you had a good year, or are you getting sick of all this?
Well, go back to the 6 predictions slide for a second, if you can. And scroll up, if you don't mind. There was 17 predictions. It might be small font, but the first half, it's too small for people to see. But I made 17 predictions for this year, and 16 of them were correct. And it was a good year. Somebody wrote a book called Gary Marcus Was Right. My name became a verb.
Who wrote the book?
I mean, it's a college student, but it's not well written. It was written by AI, but the guy got the arguments right. It's actually an interesting. I mean, I only read the first chapter, but in the first chapter, he very much did get the context of how it is that I foresaw all this stuff, what's at stake, and how so many other people got it wrong. And yes, a lot of people realized this year. There were Gary Marcus apology forms circulating on the web. So, obviously I enjoyed that to some extent. I always expected to be vindicated. I didn't expect it was going to happen so soon. I enjoyed that part of it, sure.
Do you think it's the moment to retire, Gary? Take your chips off the table. Don't fall into the Oracle trap.
I did think about that writing these predictions. I was like, I can't top, and that's actually the seventh prediction. I can't top last year where we went 16 for 17. Running against the masses it's above there. But so I have, and lastly, I say, I think it's harder to predict 2026 because things have changed, because the mania around LLMs is finally reducing and people are finally being open-minded. And it's only from open-mindedness that we might get out of the horrible rut that I think we've been in for the last 5 years. So that actually makes it harder to foresee what's going to happen. Like, imagine you were in the age of alchemy, right? And you look at it and you say, this is stupid. But you don't know when people are going to start to do something better. Or another example, people thought genes were made of proteins, and they were wrong. They were wasting a lot of time trying to figure that out, trying to figure out which protein genes were made of. It was just wrong. And then Oswald Avery did this experiment to prove that it couldn't be that. Things move really quickly after people got out of an E-Day fix that was wrong, out of a rut. And I think there's a chance we get out of that rut in 2026, and that would be genuinely exciting. You'd stop seeing Gary Marcus, the generative AI skeptic, and you might see Gary Marcus saying, hey, look, this is cool stuff. We're actually starting to make some good steps. That is part of my message for 2025. This is a little bit of that. And that's
the zeitgeist is shifting. I think we're a little more cheerful. Finally, Gary, you can't exactly predict the future, but two final questions. When you and I talk again, we'll talk, I hope, many times in 2026, but in December 2026, what do you most fear on the AI front, and what would you most like to see?
What I most fear is just this complete lack of regulation, because there's so many cascading consequences of this stuff, and leaving these companies with no liability and no rules is just going to blow up in our faces, and probably in many different ways. Like, do I have one specific fear? No, it's actually, the thing about this technology is it can be used in many different ways that are dangerous. And I don't have one that's at the top of the list. Maybe disinformation disrupting elections is at the top of the list, and there's been some of that already, and we'll probably see more. But there's many different fears, and there's also different fears at different time scales, and they all come back to the fact that LLMs are not reliable and they're not regulated, and that is a bad combination. And what was the other half of your question?
What you want, what you would like to see.
What I would like to see is a lot more AI research on alternatives to LLMs and some kind of serious regulatory regime that holds the companies responsible for what they do and gives some oversight.
Well, there you have it, Gary. As always, an honor, pleasure. You're very generous with your time. Have a very safe and healthy and prosperous 2026, and we will talk in the not too distant future. Thank you so much.
Always a pleasure. Great to see you.